Hello, everybody. So thank you to St. Anselm's, thank you to the various centers, Center for Ethics, the Center for Nonprofits. I'm sure I'm forgetting other centers out there, but I'm really pleased to be here. I'm pleased that the weather cooperated, and I'm pleased to be talking about what I think is a subject of real enormous consequence for us. It happened after Giving Tuesday, but as Kathleen said, this is a problem and an issue that we should be thinking about on a daily basis. So I'm going to be talking, as you see, about the relationship between philanthropy and democracy. I'll be talking about one particular dimension of that relationship, because there are others, and this is why the conversation can get kind of messy. After all, to some extent, you can consider philanthropy itself, philanthropic giving, to be an expression of democracy in a kind of Tocquevillian sense. It's a way that we express ourselves, that we engage civically. And of course, throughout history, philanthropy has claimed to support democracy through gifts, through supporting electoral reform, increasing the franchise, funding civic education. I'm going to be talking about a slightly different dimension to the relationship, and that is one that I think is actually getting the most attention these days. And that is this tension between those two values, philanthropy and democracy. I think it's fair to say that we are in a period of surging critique of philanthropy, a time in which that tension is becoming more and more a kind of salient focus. And that critique is often grounded in this question of what is this relationship between philanthropy and democracy. I want to give you a little taste of that criticism here. Here on just out of curiosity, has anyone had any encounters with these books? Has anyone seen, for instance, Anand Giridhas's on social media, or he's a Twitter virtuoso. It puts me to shame. He's really done more than anything else to kind of shape this discourse. But there's been a series of really important books on the topic. But there's also been some really high-profile news stories. I'm going to play a brief clip. This is a program that just aired earlier last week. It's really good. It's from a comedian, Hassan Minhaj, who was on The Daily Show for quite a while, I think. He did an entire episode on the problem of philanthropy. You know you've reached a certain kind of pop cultural salience when he's focusing on you. And it's really well done. Anand does make an appearance. But I just wanted to give you a brief taste of how many Americans are actually encountering philanthropy these days. So hopefully this will work.
Sure. We always talk about how the rich make their money, right? But we almost never scrutinize how they give it away. And that matters because giving money away is one of the main ways they justify being so rich to begin with. That's why I want to talk about big philanthropy. Because on paper, it sounds great, right? Rich people are trying to make the world a better place. But are billionaires really going to save us? And is it worth everything that we give up by letting them even be so rich? Look, I'm not sure, because when you look at the big philanthropy, big picture, a little closer, there's a lot of problems. For example, according to one estimate, only about 9% of grant money makes it to communities of color. 9%, that's not good. Now look, I'm not saying charity is bad. When you Venmo $200 to a homeless shelter, that's a good thing. But big philanthropy goes way beyond basic charity that you and I do. It's a whole system of financial tools and products that help the rich give away their cash in ways that benefit them, from pooled income funds to private foundations, which help.
I think you can hear just in his tone of voice the kind of skepticism, the kind of default setting of a kind of critical orientation. And that's what I want to focus on. As I'll explain in a bit, the critique of philanthropy isn't new. As I was introduced, I'm a historian of philanthropy, and one of the parts of my job, or it's probably by this point a kind of compulsion, is to puncture holes in claims of novelty. Whenever I hear of anyone saying anything's new, it's sort of my call to action. And it turns out that actually this critical surge is not new. But I've spent enough time on social media, probably too much time, to realize that there is some newness here. There is a deep tradition of ambivalence towards philanthropy in our history, but there are also some really novel, interesting, and important elements that I think are new and deserve our attention. And so what I want to do today is talk about what some of those novel elements are. I want to explore in some detail with you all how they are manifesting themselves in a new and varied critique of philanthropy, and discuss together what those criticisms might say about the state of civil society today. I want to do this also as part of a conversation. So I'll do some talking, but I'm very much interested in opening this up. Almost all of you I know have thought about this subject, whether you know it or not. It's now, I think, important enough in all our lives that somewhere along the line you've probably questioned what the role of philanthropy is. And certainly at St. Anselm's and at the Center for Ethics in Business and Governance, we are at a place that has grappled with these issues and is in a sense the fruit of some of these issues. And so I think it's part of our responsibility to do so. So why don't we start with some brief definitions. I don't think we have to spend too much time here. You can take a quick read here. The most important thing about these definitions, one of democracy, one of philanthropy, is that when you read them, there is no necessary tension between the two. There's no reason why philanthropy would have to be in tension with democracy, right? There's no contradiction between these two definitions that would immediately make you think that they're necessarily at odds. Oh, sorry for the formatting. But that begs the question, how do we get to the point where many, many people actually do see that tension? And when you know it, that's going to require a little bit of history. But before I get into the history, I want to just ask a question from you now. When I say philanthropist, who comes to mind? Who do you think of? Bill Gates. That's I assume that'd be. Who else? Rockefeller. Okay. Anybody else? Oprah. Okay. Oprah. Carnegie. Okay. So you'll notice something very particular about those names. There's not a lot that forms a bond of commonality between, say, Oprah and Rockefeller, but there is one thing, and we'll get to that in a second, and how that's actually become part of the definition. So when the term philanthropy was first used in America at the close of the 18th century, it meant something very similar, or very close to its initial early Greek origins. And those are the term itself, philanthropia, it's formed from the combination of two Greek words, phileo meaning friendship or sometimes love, and anthropos meaning humankind. So the word means a lover or a friend of all humanity. It was first used to describe Prometheus in a play attributed to Aeschylus in the 5th century BCE. Now, I'm just to refresh your memory, Prometheus was the demigod who stole fire from the gods and gave it to humankind. He was punished for this act of philanthropy, by being chained to a rock and having an eagle peck out his liver for all eternity. So I just wanted to remind people that if you think philanthropists have it bad these days, things could get worse. It's also, I mean, you can't. I spared you guys. There's some very gory. If you do a Google search on Prometheus and eagle, say you get some very gory images. This is one that's actually suitable for family discussions. But anyway, so the term itself had this meaning. And it was as much a feeling as it was an act. It could describe an inner state as much as a formal the way that it would actually be demonstrated formally. And it was often used to describe a kind of sense of millennial possibilities, of grand ambitions. Charity was understood as local, but philanthropy, when it was used, was often used to describe national ambitions. You can hear this sense of excitement about these possibilities in the exclamation of a Boston minister from 1783. He said, "Remember, our benevolence is not confined, it is philanthropy." I think we still, some of those echoes of that excitement, that lack of confinement, we can still hear today. Philanthropy also back then didn't have elitist overtones. And that was one of the main differences in the way that the term was used in the colonies and in England. There you see good old Cotton Mather. He was one of the first people to kind of describe an ethic of philanthropy in the colonies. And it was very clear it was something that would be suitable not just to the religious and economic elite, but for everybody. In fact, philanthropy had egalitarian overtones that would continue because it was associated with the French Revolution and with anti-slavery activism. So it was very much democratic in some respects. Now, that doesn't mean that everybody was equally philanthropic, right? There were people who happened to be more generous and more compassionate than other people. Those qualities aren't, those qualities weren't equally distributed throughout the population back then, and they're not now. But people didn't find that inequity a problem to democracy. So if you ask somebody in the early 19th century or late 18th century who the great philanthropist was of their era, they would probably say somebody like John Howard. Now, does anyone recognize that name? John Howard was the great prison reformer of his generation. He was an English reformer that visited the poor in prisons all over Europe, would minister to them, and died, in fact, at the end of the 18th century after contracting typhus in a Ukrainian prison. He was hailed as the great philanthropist of his age and was the first civilian to be buried, to get a statue in St. Paul's Cathedral. That's who the sort of exemplary philanthropist was back then. But if you ask that same question, who do you think of when you hear the phrase philanthropist? At the end of the 19th century or the start of the 20th, you'd get a very different answer, an answer that sounds much like the answer we just heard. And what happened? Well, what happened is the arrival of massive fortunes created by the Industrial Revolution and concentrations of wealth that created these stores of surplus wealth that could be directed to the public good. And you had changes in the legal landscape that I won't get into now that allowed for the establishment of general purpose foundations. So all of a sudden, you had this combination of lots and lots of surplus wealth and the apparatus to be able to spend it in these grand ways, so you could actually achieve some of this unconfined ambitions that the term initially had. So if you ask somebody who the great philanthropist was at the start of the 20th century, they would probably say Rockefeller or Carnegie. We moved from Howard to Rockefeller in 100 years. So what made Rockefeller special? It's not that he had exceptional levels of kindness. He wasn't especially compassionate. He had a lot of money. He had a lot of money. And in fact, plenty of people thought that money was made in ways that weren't particularly kind. So it won't be surprising if Rockefeller is the face of philanthropy, that around this time you start to get real public conversations about this tension between philanthropy and democracy. There had been concerns about concentrated wealth, and there had been even legal limitations on what you could do with charitable bequests since the founding of a nation. But the public conversations that assumed a kind of fundamental tension between philanthropy and democracy really required Rockefeller to be the face of philanthropy for those conversations to really take on. And if anyone thinks that it's kind of weird these days that whenever a billionaire makes a major donation and the public response is sort of like, eh. I mean, I don't think I'm the only person who's noticed that. You should know that that was sort of, I don't think you would have, whatever the translated meh is in early Gilded Age speak, you had something very similar back then as well. One, in 1913, a New York newspaper described the public response to Rockefeller's $100 million foundation creation as an attitude of, quote, philosophic toleration, which basically translates into meh. And the headline was, "The Great Rockefeller Gift, Let Us Have No More of the Like." I think we've heard similar headlines today. So anyway, there were widespread concerns that this foundation he was creating was a fundamental threat to democracy, that it was a means of laundering Rockefeller's tainted reputation, that it was a way to take regulators' scent off of Standard Oil, his big conglomerate, and that it was a way of usurping power that should actually reside with the public. These fears did not disappear. In fact, many of them should seem somewhat familiar to those of us who follow the world of philanthropy. There's been a permanent undercurrent of ambivalence that has dogged philanthropy really since the beginning, but it's gone through surges, periods of real increase. There was one in the 1950s and the 1960s, and that led eventually to the Tax Reform Act of 1969 that created the first, the real kind of regulatory regime in which philanthropy operates. And that was triggered by fears of self-dealing, of politicized giving, of tax evasion. And then there's a surge now. I think we're very much in a new surge of concerns about the role of democracy and philanthropy. So going back to my initial premise, we have these deep reserves of ambivalence, but we also have some novel provocations. And what I want to do now is talk briefly about what some of those triggers are, because I think they can help us figure out what our role as a public should be in sort of confronting the possible tension. So here are a handful of factors that I think represent what's new in the latest surge of criticism of philanthropy. I'll just go over them now, but I'm going to talk about each of them briefly. We have a widening gap between the wealthiest and the rest of us. That's kind of coupled with a sense of economic precarity. There is a really deep and wide attack on the establishment, however you want to conceive that, and an antipathy towards elites, however you want to imagine them. You have the rise of engaged living donors. You have an incredibly varied philanthropic landscape. You have giving, which is now, large-scale giving, which is now basically being done by default in the open, publicly. You have a changing media landscape. You have the rise of mega philanthropy as a global phenomenon. And you have the decline of mass giving. So I'll talk about each of these in turn, but I'm also curious to add to that list. So after this conversation, after I've gone through the list, if there are other factors that you think are worth considering, I very much want to hear about them. So let's start with the first. There are many, many, many ways to measure this. But almost any way you do, you see that we've experienced in the last couple of decades a massive increase in the inequality between the top income earners or wealth holders and the mass. Gabriel Zuckman, an economist at Berkeley, created this graph, and he's calculated that the richest 400 Americans have seen their wealth triple since the early 1980s and now control more wealth than the bottom 60% of the wealth distribution, whose share of the wealth fell from about 5.7% in 1987 to about 2% in 2014. We're seeing levels of wealth inequality that we have seen only before during the Gilded Age and at the years right before the Great Depression. But income inequality has been around for a while, right? I mean, the spread has been going on for decades. The critique of philanthropy has really picked up only in the last decade. So it's not just income inequality that is the trigger. There's something else. And I think what that something else is, you can see by taking a look at two different, very, very public big gifts. The first was in 2006 when Warren Buffett pledged more than $30 billion to the Gates Foundation. I had just started following philanthropy, modern philanthropy, closely at this point. I had kind of been doing a lot of history and suddenly realized, wait a second, there's some contemporary stuff I should be paying attention to as well. And I think it's fair to say that the public reception to the gift was relatively positive. The New York Times ran an op-ed that called it inaugurated a golden age for philanthropy. 10 years later, when Mark Zuckerberg and Priscilla Chan made their Facebook pledge that 99% of their Facebook shares would be given to philanthropy, they did it in a Facebook post, the reception was much different. The sort of default setting was a kind of apprehension, a sort of wariness. There was some celebration, but it was muted. And what happened in between is the Great Recession. So a sense of economic precarity, a sense of resentment that the recession triggered was the fuel, I think, that translated inequality into a real critical scrutiny onto philanthropy. I think it's also important to note that the inequality that we're now grappling with is not just economic. There's inequalities in gender, in race, in sexual orientation, and a number of other dimensions as well. In all those cases, what we're seeing is a focus and challenge on the status quo and the powerful. And philanthropy is associated with the powerful, and so becomes a target. So what does this mean in terms of the critique? Again, let me step in with a little bit more history. Modern philanthropy was premised on the assumption that private philanthropy, administered by the people who made the money, could legitimize concentrated wealth. This was the great premise of Andrew Carnegie's 1889 Gospel of Wealth tract. Now, imagine me considerably shorter with a Scottish, faint Scottish accent, and you can get into the period. Thus is the problem of rich and poor to be solved. The laws of accumulation will be left free, the laws of distribution free. Individualism will continue, but the millionaire will be but a trustee for the poor, entrusted for a season with a great part of the increased wealth of the community, but administering it for the community far better than it could or would have done for itself. The idea there is that wealthy people would make lots of money, actively engage in philanthropy, and through that act, they would legitimate the accumulation itself. What Carnegie didn't see is that the opposite, the inverse, could happen as well. That's that concentrated wealth could delegitimize philanthropy. And more than that a critical focus on philanthropy could sort of go up the chain and cause us to rethink the means of accumulation itself. And I think that's what we're seeing now. It's ironic, in a sense, because what we're also seeing now is that vision that Carnegie had of engaged living donors finally coming to the fore. One of the defining features of the landscape, the philanthropic landscape over the last couple of decades, has been the enormous surge in what I call mega philanthropy, but large gifts. Here you see plotted the number of foundations on one axis and the share of wealth owned by the 1%. There are many ways to track this, but we're seeing increasingly what would have been sort of earth-shattering news in terms of gifts with lots and lots of zeros attached to them are now relegated to sort of, the back pages of the newspaper because they're becoming sort of a standard. What's striking about this growth is that it is being driven by engaged living donors. The critiques of the 50s and 60s were critiques that focused on institutions, the Ford Foundation, the Rockefeller Foundation. The boogeymen of those critiques were what was called the philanthropoid, the philanthropy bureaucrat, right? We're living in a very, very different situation now. We now are faced with a tide, a real flood of people who've made a lot of money and are actively engaged in giving it away, and who have invoked their entrepreneurial skills as a rationale for why they actually can give it away well. This is a book that was published in 2008. I don't know if you can read the subtitles, but the subtitle on the first edition was How the Rich Can Save the World. In 2008, that was something of a hard sell. But the point it made was very powerful. I'll read you a quick excerpt. While one key ingredient of philanthrocapitalism is the responsibility and willingness of economic winners to give on a large scale, another is that they apply to their giving the same talents, knowledge, and intellectual vigor that made them rich in the first place. Philanthrocapitalism is about being a business-like giving. That is Carnegie's vision, finally, after many, many years, being realized. What I think is striking, though, and is worth repeating, is that this is actually still something novel. I think we all recognize this. I mean, anyone who's dealt with a philanthrocapitalist or anyone who has been involved in the world of philanthropy has probably encountered people who deeply believe in this ethic. And I do think it's an ethic. But that was Carnegie's vision, more than a century ago. But for most of the 20th century, that's not how philanthropy operated. I want to read two quotes. But just to give you some background, really what most of philanthropy was for the good part of the 20th century was the kind of thing you did late in life after rounds of golf and when you were considering retirement. It was really a decision that was between you, your God, and your tax lawyer. It was not an engaged vocation. Vladimir Nielsen was the great chronicler of late 20th century philanthropy. When he kind of canvassed the major donors in the 80s, he was struck by how little thought most of them had actually given to philanthropy. And he writes, far from being wise, far-sighted, public-spirited, purposeful benefactors, many of the big donors set up their foundations, if not in a fit of absent-mindedness, then simply as part of a tidying up their affairs at the end of a lifetime devoted to business and the acquisition of wealth. There's not much philanthrocapitalism there. It's sort of an afterthought. As late as 1999, a philanthropy scholar did a similar survey. This was a moment at which you had the first stirrings of this new upsurge of wealth, and he was thinking that this was when the Gates Foundation was just getting off the ground. And he writes, philanthropy has become a controversial matter these days, particularly when donors make their own decisions about how and when to spend their money, rather than leaving those details to professionals in the foundations they have set up. It's striking to me that he finds that striking. I mean, I think it's probably rarer to find a donor these days who is willing to defer to the professional staff than it is to find an actively engaged donor. And I don't want to slight active engagement. I think it's an incredibly important part of the landscape. But it does do something very particular about the way the criticisms of philanthropy are understood. I'll get to those a little bit later, but fundamentally it brings way, way to the fore this question of how the money was actually made. In part because that rationale is being actively invoked often in the act of philanthropy itself. And there are lots of philanthropic leaders, I think of Darren Walker at the Ford Foundation, for instance, who aren't just giving publicly, they're criticizing and critiquing philanthropy publicly. So the discussions about philanthropy, which used to be something of a kind of backdoor operation, are now very much in the public view. And it's not a surprise then that the criticism would rise accordingly. The 2016 election really helped in this regard. No matter what you think about the results, it was the election in which foundations played more of a role than any we've seen in the past. Lots of reporters had no idea what they did, how to look at 990 forms. And it was a real education, not just to them, but to the public as well. It sort of, it introduced philanthropy into the news bloodstream in a way, and I think it hasn't fully left. On the left, you won't be able to read it, but I'll read it for you, so we just talked about Bezos. This was literally reacting to that story. Jeremy Corbyn, the Labour leader, read that story, and he tweeted out, that's 0.9% of your net worth, just pay your taxes. He's speaking to a domestic audience there. He's not trying to impress American voters. The debates about American philanthropy have a kind of salience now because they represent something that many, many countries can now understand. On the right is a news story from the Times that described the reaction to donations made by two of the richest people in France after the Notre Dame fire. And what was striking was the reaction to those gifts. The reaction to those gifts were very, very similar to some of the reactions we've seen in the United States. There was a sense of, why are you giving to a church when there's lots of people who need your money? Isn't this just a way to launder your reputations? How much taxes are you actually paying? These are fundamentally American conversations, and for the French to be having them felt very new to many of them, but in the sense we're seeing a globalization of this American critique. The last element is one I want to spend a little more time on. And it's something that is actually, I think, really fundamental to this question of democracy and philanthropy. And that's that this surge in large-scale giving is coming at a moment at which the place of small giving, of regular donations, seems to be eroding. And I mean this in two ways. One is relatively speaking. So large gifts make up a greater percentage and a larger share of the fundraising of many institutions. And this is a question I always like to ask any fundraisers in the room. There we go, okay. So this is a question, you'll understand what I ask. So when I started studying the field, I always heard about the 80-20 rule, that you basically would, 80% of the gifts would come from large donors. I'm now hearing from various people, and I know there's people out there who can even have higher numbers. I've heard now that those numbers are creeping up to 90, 10, even 95-5. That is not just a professional issue. That's an issue that all of us should deal with. And you can see here, this is a change in charitable deductions by income over a 10-year period. Most income groups, actually had a decrease in the amount of deductions taken. Only one group, the group of 10 million or more, has a real marked surge. So they're the group that's responsible for a lot of the increase in giving in the last decade. a report that came out just this week that I haven't looked at the numbers closely, but the numbers themselves are so startling. Even if this is just an approximation, it's still worth citing. It claimed that donors whose net worth is 30 million or more make about 20% of all individual gifts to U.S. charities. That's an astonishing figure. And it's a figure which is actually historically an anomaly, if you look at the big picture. In the 1950s, a foundation did a survey, the Russell Sage Foundation, estimated that 80% of all charitable contributions came from those with incomes of $5,000 or less. Mass giving used to be a much, much greater part of focus in terms of sustaining our nonprofit institutions. But it's not just the relative status. It's also the declining and in the erosion of what I call a participatory element of giving. There is a drop, a pretty marked drop, of people who actually donate any year. This data is from a survey from the University of Michigan, and it shows that between 2000 and 2016, 20 million Americans dropped off the donor list. 20 million Americans stopped defining themselves as charitable donors. And the drop is most pronounced amongst those giving to religious causes and lower income Americans. More money is being raised every year. So between 2008 and 2016, we saw significant increases in aggregate totals. Why should we care if mass giving declines if we're actually raising more and more money? I'm only asking that half rhetorically. And the reason why I'm only doing it half is because if you look at our tax policy, the tax policy doesn't seem to care, right? All the tax preferences, the incentives, are actually geared towards sort of higher income individuals. There is no clear preference for a participatory culture of giving in our public policy at this point, really. The bias is actually the opposite. The bias is towards the kind of increasing aggregate giving as much as possible. So why should we care? I mean, what is the grounds for actually taking this seriously? I want to throw out two explanations, but this is something I would love to talk about more afterwards. One is this idea of social capital. There was a Senate report on this. This is actually a subject, weirdly enough, one of the few subjects that you can actually get Democrats and Republicans to engage, I think, pretty constructively on is this question. There's still, I think, some real room for compromise on this. The Senate report said that individual investment in social capital often creates benefits for the entire community, such as norms of trust and reciprocity. A shrinking share of donors, no matter how generous, cannot replace widespread altruism and commitment to improving a community. This is a sense that giving, again, is a kind of civic act, and that it creates better citizens. And that if people are not giving, they're losing a chance to do something which can really help build communities. Here are two recent critiques of $400 million gifts to higher ed. On the left, you have Malcolm Gladwell. Any Malcolm Gladwell fans in the audience? New Yorker writer, a great nonfiction writer, who basically rips apart this donor to Harvard Engineering School because it seemed to him ridiculous that was the best way that he could spend his money. Here we have a piece from Dylan Matthews, a great writer from an online publication called Vox. Another $400 million gift to a fellowship program at Stanford, and the title is, "For the love of God, rich people, stop giving Stanford money." What's striking about these two responses is the anger, the complete and total lack of deference to donor prerogative that you see in them. Anger that gifts are going to elite institutions, anger that there are so many other institutions left behind, And the second idea is this idea that we have to judge a gift not just against the good that it can do. No one was doubting that Stanford could make some good use of the money. And no one was debating about the good that an engineering school could do. The argument was that in order to judge a gift, you have to judge the opportunity cost in a sense. You have to judge what else could be done with that money. This is often a view associated with effective altruism, which is a kind of a fringe movement in general, but it's a movement that has enormous salience with a kind of young tech crowd. The idea is that if you know that you can save a life by buying anti-malaria bed nets, then you have to justify these sort of gifts against that reality. The other critique that I think we've all encountered is this question of tainted money. Who do you guys think of when I say tainted money? Sackler, okay? That's anything else? Taika, okay? Epstein, yes. So I mean, but these Kochbrothers. So these are names that are at the forefront of philanthropy stories these days. There's a long tradition of this. It's hard to see, but that is Rockefeller sticking money bags into something that's called, let's see, what does it say? His patent disinfectant machine. And it's spitting out money for missionaries. Here on the right, this is a die-in at the Guggenheim to protest the museum's acceptance of Sackler money. Those pieces of paper are supposed to be prescriptions that rain down on the protesters. Anyway, so this is a form of challenge to philanthropy with a long tradition. It's discussed in the Talmud. There were debates about whether or not churches should accept money from prostitutes. It was a major issue in the Gilded Age. But it's becoming increasingly more salient now. And I think there's a clear reason why that's the case. And that's because questions of economic justice and injustice, I think, are becoming more salient. You have the classic visible strings problem of power. That's the gift that has conditions attached to it, right? We all have heard about that. In higher ed, it's a huge problem. Donors who insist on particular faculty being chosen or books being read. And I think we can all agree that there is problematic elements to that. What's more interesting to me is the question of invisible strings. And this was actually a topic that in the early 20th century, there was some really sophisticated thinking about. Even back then, people understood that the problem was not visible strings, because those actually, by definition, you could see, you could guard against, you could take precautions against. But the ways in which invisible strings clung to big gifts, the way that in which the promise of money would prevent certain acts from taking place. That if you knew that big donors were out there, you wouldn't do certain things. You wouldn't touch certain topics. You would be reluctant to engage in certain types of reform. There was nothing explicitly stated. There was no demands being made. It was all unspoken, and because of that, it was even more pernicious. So how are we dealing with those strings now? There is the question, which I sort of alluded to earlier on, that the wealthy have different views and viewpoints and preferences to the rest of us, and that by acting philanthropically, they're literally imposing these different viewpoints on the rest of a population and giving themselves sort of disproportionate influence. We know, for instance, that wealthy tend to hold more conservative economic views. They are less likely to believe that the economic system is rigged. We've seen that they give to large institutions that they tend to patronize. And they tend to favor certain modes of thinking, entrepreneurial modes, technocratic modes, biomedical modes. This is a big deal in global development. The point is not necessarily that those are wrong ways of approaching problems. The issue is that they are disproportionately privileged as opposed to many other ways of addressing problems. There's a kind of critique of any top-down approach at not engaging local perspectives. And that because of this, there's a disruption of community life when local views aren't consulted. I think it's always kind of weird that disruption is a term of praise. You know, it's a good thing in the philanthropic community. But when you're living your life, like disruption to me is a traffic jam that basically, you know, forces you to pick an alternative route and makes you late to pick up your kid or something. Disruption on the ground can be a real pain. And there's often a kind of mismatch between the kind of valorization of disruption as a guiding ethic and the lived experience of disruption on the ground when you're dealing with experiment and risk-taking. So I'm over the time limit. I'm happy to continue this conversation. I want to thank you guys all for indulging me and for the terrific questions. It was a real privilege and honor. Thank you.